This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today we are talking about reality-based fiction. So, what do you want to know about reality-based fiction?
This is
it's
that
fiction,
conundrum. No, this is the conundrum where it's fiction, but you're writing about real people or real events in history, or something that is legit happened and has a sequence of things, or a person that you need to stay true to, or whatever. And how do you honor that and still have the fiction aspect?
Sure.
It's that balance.
Well, first off, you have to acknowledge that you are writing fiction. It is not reality. It is not truth. It has a nugget of truth. So, let's just make that plain. It's not memoir. It's not creative nonfiction. It's not a biopic. It's fiction. We're establishing that. On the other hand, if you're choosing to use a historical figure's name or a historical event that is, commonly widely enough known that you could get in trouble for making factual errors or portraying somebody in a light that either is not very well grounded in historical fact or reality, or could lead to libel or slander lawsuits, right?
Worst case scenario.
Right. Yeah, you have to watch out for that side of things as well. So you're going to want to use reality as a framework for the story you want to tell if you're using an event or a timeline that is real, like the journey of the Titanic or the Hindenburg or whatever it is. Those people know about those. There's a ton of information on it. So you're going to want to cover your bases. And then within that framework, you can create your fictional characters. You can tell the story you want to tell, right, within that factual structure. If you're putting an individual character who is a historical figure, and I keep saying historical because I don't, do you really want to fictionalize somebody who could sue you today? Right?
Probably not.
Probably not. But then you need to look at, what do we know about this person? What is this person's reputation? How can I represent this person in a way that is what I want for my story, but also not going to get me in trouble or turn off readers who think I just got it wrong. There's that suspension of disbelief piece. Ragtime is one book that, now I'm blanking on the authors.
That's okay. We'll find it.
We'll put it in the show notes. And I should know it, but I'm not home right now, so my bookcases are 1,000 miles away from me. But E.L. Doctorow, I believe. So, Henry Ford is a character in there, and there's the construction of a bridge that, is a real bridge. And there are other figures like Ford who have minor parts in this book. And so the story, they are not our protagonists, but they make appearances. And so as readers, we want to read that and go, yeah, I get it. I get that that's Henry Ford. And I don't need to go read a biography of Henry Ford to believe that's him. And I also don't really care how accurate it is as a reader, because it's accurate enough in the context of the story for me to enjoy it. It doesn't go astray in a way that I'm like, what? What is he doing with Ford?
Right. So what about books I know Wolf Hall was really popular a while ago because that won some awards and things like that, where it's about the royal family in Great Britain and the people surrounding them, and they aren't necessarily saying this is who they were, but they're using all the names, they're using the entire court infrastructure, like all the people that would have been players at that point in time, and then dramatizing that. What about stuff like that? Well, broad question.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I haven't read Wolf Hall or watched it, so just speaking more generally instead of specifically, I would say it goes back to what I was saying before about where you want to use the historical fact as a framework for your story. And Wolf Hall wasn't that. How long ago was that set? That was a very long time ago, right?
Yeah, it was Elizabeth's court, so yeah. Okay,
so not so long ago that we don't know anything about these people's lives. I mean, that's, actually relatively recent. Yeah, if you can create characters, if you're using real people's names, I think you want to be honoring what is known about those real people, while also taking creative license to tell the story you need to tell. So it's finding that balance. And the more we know about a historical figure, I think the more you need to honor the fact that there is information out there that readers could call you out on getting it wrong. Readers might not appreciate it if you use a historical figure and then go far afield. Because if you're going to do that, why not just use different names?
Right.
Why not just...
Yeah, if you're not making it obvious that it's an alt history, then, like you say, I mean, these days we have very educated readers in the sense that everyone's got Dr. Google at their fingertips, so it's pretty easy to find, whether that's accurate or not. I mean, not that I'm saying the information on the internet is necessarily correct either. I've heard many an author talk about something that they researched meticulously, whether it be how a particular piece of equipment worked or something that they knew because they'd had a career in it, only to have a reviewer correct them incorrectly.
Right.
So it's exactly. So it's tricky, I think, and at some point, how far? I guess it's a question of author voice as well. Is do you want to be known as a meticulous historian when you produce your novels, or is it a fast-paced action thriller that just happens to name drop some famous figures from that era and give us a sense of what the cobblestones were like and not much else? So
sure,
I suppose to some degree it depends what you're drawing from your setting.
Yes, absolutely. You have a responsibility not only to your story but also to historical fact and to your reader, and so that degree of responsibility really varies depending on how you're using the historical figure or the historical fact. So, as you were just saying, Robert, if you're just name dropping like a figure from the period, like we're under the reign of Queen Victoria, or this is the street Jack the Ripper roamed, or whatever, then fine, it adds a little bit of color. No big deal. But if you're writing a story about Jack the Ripper, then you should use as many facts as you can, because even a reader who doesn't come to the story with knowledge of that history might say, oh, that was such an interesting story. Now I need to go learn more about Jack the Ripper. And then if they find out you did everything wrong, you just made it up and maybe use the title Jack the Ripper as an enticement, it feels like a bait and switch, and it feels like you didn't do your job as an author. So that responsibility piece is multifaceted. And, again, in that case, just change the name, just make it all fiction, because there's no reason to use historical fact unless you have a reason to use historical fact. Another book I like is The Heretic's Daughter. And again, I'm going to blank on the name for a little while. But this author, she learned that one of her like great grandmothers was persecuted during the Salem witch trials. So she did her genealogical research. She did her research into the Salem witch trials and life in that period. And then she wrote a novel that is based on that research. Mm-hmm. So it's the story of her ancestors, but of course there was only so much of that actual story available. So she had to piece together what life was like, what society was like, what culture was like, fashion, family structure, food, what the trials were like, what the prison situation was like, how people were killed. It was actually hanging, not burning, all that kind of stuff. And then synthesize it into a novel. So it's not her ancestors' biography. It's not nonfiction. It's not historical scholarship. It is a novel. But we can all understand why, with that family history, she was compelled to tell this story. So there's a great reason,
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's mostly you've really got to be most careful probably when it's around public events that people have generalized knowledge of, or they've been perhaps taught in school or something like that, as opposed to being slightly different, which is setting, which we all know you have to create some kind of sense of reality for the reader, whether it's going to be historically accurate or whether it's science fiction. And they've got to have some believability about how spaceships travel, for example, even if it's not meeting current levels of physics. You need some way of introducing that. But that might be different to, say, if I'm then writing a science fiction novel that is based around the first moon landing. At that point, then I've got to start thinking about, there's a lot of general public knowledge about this. How do I use that without getting sucked into it?
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, in that example, we know things, but we don't know a lot of the gaps. We have if you were to write down everything that we knew exactly and how it order, like, of a story, you'd have like a tiny little story, like an outline of a story. So, but you would want to be really careful to honor exactly what that, what it meant to people, as well as, who the people were. And, that would be really interesting to try to craft something like that together.
Yeah, it would be, definitely. And you would need to decide too, are you going to use, who's your protagonist? If you're using a historical figure in a major role in your story, then that increases that responsibility piece to accuracy. If all of the historical figures are supporting characters and your protagonist, the one whose head we're in, is fictional, then you've got that creative license, more of the creative license to tell a story around an event or around certain figures, and to kind of get us into those spaces between the common knowledge and do some invention with less risk of getting it wrong, offending people, throwing readers, all that kind of stuff.
Right. And that would make sense, because you need your protagonist to have like those flaws and those things that they're working on. And if you take a beloved historical figure and give them flaws that people don't agree with or something, then you're going to have, people up in arms at you.
Yeah, or even a despised historical figure. And
give them empathy, and then or empathic, empathetic qualities, or you think something that we can relate to, and all of a sudden you're no longer in the reader's happy spot.
Right. I mean, as writers, I would just say, why do you want to use a real figure or a real event instead of going for full-on invention? Because there are lots of good reasons to do it, but then you're setting yourself up for much more research, much more accountability, and depending on where in history, current or, recent or not, that is, the potential for you know,
right.
the individual or estate to be upset at you. So just be aware of that. I've written, so one of my manuscripts, God's Mirror, is based on a 13th century French mystic who was the first person burned at the stake for heresy by the Inquisition in France. And almost nothing is known about her life. So I took the facts that I could find and used them as a framework, as a timeline. And I invented the character based on what we know about the figure. And then it's an imagining of her life. What kind of life, what kind of experiences would lead a person to end up in that situation. Right. So that her life or her death actually was compelling to me, enough so that I wanted to invent a story around an imagined life for her. In another manuscript of mine, it's set in Victorian Minnesota. So I've taken actual events and fictionalized them, you know, like the Civil War soldiers returning home to Minnesota, amputees, young men. A lot of them died of malaria after getting home, you know, so they make it out of the war just to die here, and sort of the social issues around that. I've got a character who's based on a real historical figure, Julia Bullard Nelson, and you wouldn't know that just reading the novel. But you could read the author's note at the end and go, oh, that's cool. So this crazy radical feminist Lucy is actually based on this real person. You know, so there are lots of ways to incorporate history and still take creative license and tell the story you want to tell.
Yeah, I mean, also, I mean, you look at things. I mean, Stephen King, I think, is very good at this, in particular with setting, because I think he seems to have a fascination for era and epoch. And if you read, I mean, you know, he even took on Kennedy's assassination in the 11/22/63, which my wife didn't particularly like, but I quite enjoyed, and I thought it was a really interesting take. And so you get taken from more or less the current day back into actually the late 50s. I think it starts. It's quite a complex story, but it's really interesting how the different epoch comes through, and there are publicly acknowledged and known events that impact. You know, where was Kennedy going? Why was he there? And all those sort of things. Right. And then the characters are all assembling around this, and it's quite fascinating. And he has some very extensive author notes at the back with all of his research. So yeah, it is interesting what you can do in sort of close to reality, but yeah, it's an alternate. You know, it's a time travel book. You know,
right?
With, you know, it's absolutely out there.
It is.
So how important is that author's note in the back for something like that, like a reality-based fiction like that? How important is it to show your reader at the end your research or what you based it on? Oh,
well, I think it's optional. It's ultimately up to the author, but why wouldn't you do it? Because if you've done your due diligence, if you've put all that effort into being responsible to history and your story and your readers, that is so fascinating to me as a reader, to many people who read this kind of fiction. So I want to be able to find out what the author was thinking, what kind of research she did, where I can find out more about these things. So I would say it's very important, but it's definitely optional. It's more, why wouldn't you provide that? It's such a fun resource. And, you know, if you do encounter something fascinating or controversial, then it's a way to say to your reader, you know, everybody thinks this happened, but my research uncovered this other thing. And wow, I really wanted to explore that in my story. So you can also kind of balance areas where a reader might not suspend disbelief because of a misconception that's commonly held, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, kind of work with some of that too.
It might just help that reviewer not incorrectly correct you.
Right. Yes, if they read the author's note. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you would hope if someone was that into it that they were going to go look it up, that if you had provided some research in the back that they would look at that first.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or questions about reality-based fiction? Nope. All right. Nope. Well, it's been another fun conversation here at the round table. Please head over to Storyworks Writers on Facebook and let us know if you have any thoughts or questions about reality-based fiction. Hey guys, the Structure of Story is now open. This is a Storyworks Fiction nuts and bolts course, and it's all about structure. Because often structure isn't taught. People assume it's just a natural byproduct of writing. Like, if you write a story, you'll intuitively know how long to make your scenes, where to place chapter breaks, and how to maximize the effects of dramatic or comedic action. But that really isn't true. Yes, literature is an art form, but like all other art forms, it springs from a definite working knowledge of craft. By learning the mechanics of story structure, you'll be able to identify the key elements of your story, shape them to increase your story's desired effect on your readers, and turn craft concepts into tools that you have at your disposal whenever you sit down to write. You can find out more about the structure of story and preview 2 of the modules, including 3.2, which is all about chapters, at storyworksfiction.com. This course is open, it's live, it's ready to enroll. Head over to storyworksfiction.com, get the preview, and I'll see you in the classroom. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.